The sun was already high in the sky when Luke guided his horse into the small frontier town. The dust rose with every hoofbeat, drifting across the road, clinging to boots and settling on every window. The town was buzzing with activity that day. Merchants shouted about their goods, children ran around the water trough, and townsfolk exchanged news in low voices. Luke, however, was a man of quiet habits. He rode in to buy supplies and leave again, never looking for trouble, never asking for attention. People knew him, but only as that cowboy who keeps to himself. He tied his horse outside the general store and was about to step inside when he noticed a commotion. On the far side of the street, an old woman had stumbled. She had been carrying a bundle of sticks strapped to her back, perhaps gathered for firewood, and when her foot caught on a stone, she fell forward with a sharp cry. The bundle spilled, the sticks scattering into the dust. For a moment, the crowd that had gathered simply watched. Some even chuckled as if it were some kind of show. The old woman's long gray hair tumbled loose from her braid, her wrinkled hands trying to push herself up, but her knees shook too much. Luke froze. The woman was Apache, and in that town many people carried old prejudices. To them she was just someone to avoid, someone who did not belong in their eyes. That was why no one was helping her. Instead, whispers spread, words meant to mock. A group of young men near the saloon leaned against the post, laughing openly. "Look at that," one said, nudging his friend. "Old squaw can't even walk straight." Others passed by, shaking their heads, but no one bent down. Luke's jaw tightened. He was not a man who liked being in the center of attention. He preferred the wide-open plains where only the wind spoke, but he could not turn his back on someone in need. His boots carried him across the street before he even thought about it. The laughter grew louder as he knelt down beside the woman. "Here," he said gently, offering his hand. His voice was calm, steady, respectful. The woman looked up at him, her eyes sharp and dark, though her body trembled with age. She hesitated for a heartbeat, as if deciding whether to trust him. Then, with a small nod, she placed her hand in his. Her palm was rough, the skin thin, but her grip was firm. Luke helped her up slowly, steadying her as she found her balance again. Her bundle of sticks still lay scattered on the ground. Without a word, Luke bent to gather them, tying them back together with the rope she had used. The crowd murmured. Some mocked, others smirked, and a few shook their heads. "Well, look at the cowboy now," one voice jeered. "Helping the likes of her." Another man laughed loudly, slapping his thigh. "Guess he's got nothing better to do." The words stung like burrs, not because Luke cared about their opinion, but because their laughter was cruel. He ignored them, lifting the bundle and setting it carefully on the woman's back once more. When he was done, he tipped his hat politely. "There you go, ma'am," he said softly. The woman's lips curved into the faintest smile. She reached into the small pouch tied around her waist, pulled out a small flask, and held it toward him. "Water," she whispered, her voice low but clear. Luke shook his head at first, but she insisted, pressing it into his hand. He took a small sip, then gave it back, nodding in thanks. By now, the whispers in the street had turned into laughter again. The group of men outside the saloon clapped sarcastically, calling out, "A real hero, savior of old bones." One even mimed stumbling in the dirt, pretending to fall, making the others roar with laughter. Luke stood tall, his face steady, not giving them the reaction they wanted. He knew how the town worked. If you rose to their bait, they'd never stop. So he simply adjusted his hat, guided the woman gently to the side of the road where she could rest, and stepped back. The woman sat down on a wooden crate by a shop's wall, breathing heavily but smiling faintly at him. "Thank you," she said softly, her words heavy with sincerity. Luke gave her a small nod, then turned to leave, hoping to slip away quietly. But the laughter followed him. As he walked back to his horse, he could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, mocking, whispering, jeering. For a cowboy, pride was everything, and humiliation was hard to swallow. Yet Luke felt no shame in what he had done. If anything, he felt anger at the cruelty of others. But he kept it hidden, letting it burn quietly inside. He bought his supplies quickly and returned to the saddle. As he rode out of town, the sound of laughter still echoed in his ears. But louder than that in his heart was the look of gratitude in the old woman's eyes. That memory stayed with him long after the dust of the town faded behind. On the trail back toward his small cabin near the hills, Luke thought about what had happened. He had grown up believing that helping others was not weakness but strength. His father had taught him that long ago, back when Luke was a boy learning to ride. "Son," his father used to say, "a man's worth isn't measured by how many cattle he owns or how fast he can draw his gun. It's measured by whether he lends his hand when no one else will." Those words echoed in his mind now. The humiliation he faced in town was real, but Luke reminded himself that the laughter of the crowd meant little compared to a single act of kindness. He replayed the moment of her hand gripping his, the way her eyes had softened when he helped her stand. That, he thought, was what mattered. The prairie stretched before him, golden in the sunlight, the horizon wide and endless. Luke breathed deep, letting the open air clear away the bitterness of the town. Yet a small part of him wondered, who was that woman really? And why did her eyes, sharp as flint yet warm as fire, seem to look right through him? He did not know then that this small act of compassion, mocked by many, would soon change the course of his life. The next morning, Luke woke to the sound of birdsong outside his cabin. The night before, he had replayed the scene in town over and over again, hearing the laughter of the cowboys and townsfolk. Yet every time he remembered their mocking, he also remembered the quiet strength in the old woman's eyes and the soft "thank you" she had spoken. That memory made him rise with a sense of calm. He wasn't proud of being laughed at, but he wasn't ashamed either. He knew he had done the right thing, and his father's lesson still guided him even when the world chose to jeer. Luke saddled his horse and rode into the hills. He worked his cattle that day, checking the fences, guiding strays back to the herd, and clearing brush near the stream. He lived a simple life, one that gave him peace, but while he worked, his mind returned to the old woman. There had been something unusual about the way she had looked at him. It was as if she had seen deeper than most people cared to look. He wondered if he would ever see her again, or if their paths had crossed only for that moment. As the sun began to set, Luke guided his horse back toward his cabin. To his surprise, he saw a figure waiting near his gate. It was the old woman. She stood straighter now, her gray hair neatly braided, her presence quiet but firm. Luke slowed his horse, puzzled. "Evening, ma'am," he greeted, tipping his hat.
"Can I help you?"
The woman gave him a small smile, her eyes glinting in the fading light. "You already did," she replied softly. Her voice, though aged, carried a strength that made Luke sit straighter in his saddle. She told him her name was Nahele. "I wish to thank you properly," she added, stepping closer. Luke dismounted and tied his horse to the post. He wasn't sure what to expect. Nahele asked if she might sit with him for a moment. Luke invited her to the wooden bench by his porch, where the two of them sat quietly at first, the silence filled by the sound of crickets and the breeze through the grass. Finally, Nahele spoke. "I have seen how men in that town behave. Many look only with their eyes and not with their hearts. They laughed at you, but you did not waver. That tells me much about you." Luke shifted uncomfortably, unused to praise. "It wasn't much," he said simply. "Anyone should have helped." Nahele shook her head. "Yet no one else did. That is the difference." For a while they talked. She told him how she lived in a small hut near the edge of the desert, how she gathered wood and herbs each day, and how she had grown used to being invisible to those in town. "I am old," she said, "but I still have eyes to see the truth in people. Kindness is rare, and when I see it, I remember it." Luke listened respectfully. There was dignity in her words, a quiet pride that did not ask for pity. He realized then that she was not as frail as the town had made her seem. Her fall in the marketplace had shown weakness in her body, yes, but her spirit was strong. She had endured much, and yet she carried herself with grace. When the evening grew cooler, Nahele stood. "I would like you to walk with me tomorrow," she said, "to my home. There are things I wish to share with you." Luke was taken aback. He was not used to being asked into someone else's world so openly. Yet something in her steady gaze told him that this was important. "All right," he agreed. "I'll come." The next day, after finishing his morning chores, Luke rode out toward the edge of the desert where Nahele said she lived. He found her waiting on the trail, standing with her bundle of sticks neatly tied beside her. She walked slowly, but her steps were firm, and Luke led his horse beside her. The two traveled across the dusty path until they reached her small hut, built of adobe and wood, sitting against a cluster of rocks. Luke noticed at once that the place carried a quiet beauty. Brightly woven rugs lay across the doorway. Inside, the air smelled faintly of sage and pine. Dried herbs hung from the beams, their leaves rustling softly. Along the walls were carvings of animals and figures, each carefully shaped by hand. Everything spoke of care, patience, and tradition. Luke removed his hat and stepped inside respectfully. Nahale poured water into clay cups and set them on the table. "You may think yesterday was small," she said, "but in my eyes it was not. The way a man treats the weak shows who he truly is." She looked at him steadily. "I have seen men ride with pride and power. But pride fades. A good heart endures." Luke nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to being studied like this. He had always thought of himself as ordinary, a man simply doing what was right without expecting anything in return. Yet Nahale spoke as though his actions meant more than he realized. As the sun dipped low outside, Nahale leaned forward slightly. "I have something to show you," she said. She stepped into a small back room and returned with a carefully wrapped bundle. Setting it on the table, she opened it to reveal a collection of woven cloths, each with intricate patterns. The colors were deep and rich, telling stories in their designs: rivers, mountains, stars, and animals. "This is what my people pass down," she explained. "Each thread is chosen with care. Each pattern has meaning. When I saw you bend down to help me, I thought of these patterns. They tell us that life is woven together, strong threads beside weak, bright colors beside dark. Without all, the design is incomplete. You chose to be one of the strong threads." Luke studied the cloths, admiring their detail. "They're beautiful," he said softly. Nahale smiled. "Beauty means little if there is no one to carry it forward. That is why I watch people carefully, and that is why I wished you to see this." Luke realized then that her invitation was more than gratitude. It was trust. She had opened a window into her life, something she did not do for everyone. He felt humbled. When it was time to leave, Nahale walked him to the door. The stars were beginning to appear, bright against the desert sky. She looked up at them, then turned back to Luke. "Many will laugh at what they do not understand," she said. "But those who see clearly will not laugh forever." Her words lingered with him as he rode away into the night. As Luke returned to his cabin, he thought about her again and again. The townsfolk had mocked him, yet here was a woman who saw value in what he had done. It made him wonder if perhaps he had underestimated the impact of his choices. He went to bed that night with a new thought in his heart, that sometimes the simplest act of kindness opened doors to worlds he never expected, and though he did not know it yet, the door Nahale had opened for him was only the beginning of something far greater. The following week, Luke went about his usual work, yet he noticed something different when he rode into town. The story of him helping the old Apache woman had spread further. It seemed almost everyone had heard, and nearly everyone had an opinion. When Luke walked into the general store, whispers followed him. Some people looked at him with smirks, others with curiosity, and a few with quiet respect. The teasing had not ended, but something had changed in the air. A group of young men leaning near the saloon waved mockingly as he passed. "There goes the Apache's cowboy," one of them called, his voice full of laughter. Another added, "Careful, he might fetch firewood for you if you stumble." The men roared with laughter. Luke ignored them. He had learned long ago that words only carried weight if you gave them power. Still, the sting of their jeers pressed against him. Inside the saloon, the atmosphere wasn't much different. A card game paused when he walked in, and a man at the bar raised his glass in a mocking toast. "To the town's newest hero," the man said with a crooked smile. A few chuckled, but Luke kept his face steady, ordered a simple drink, and sat quietly in the corner. He could feel the eyes on him, weighing, testing, mocking, but he also caught a glance or two from townsfolk who didn't laugh, like the storekeeper's wife, who gave him a small nod, and an older rancher who watched with thoughtful eyes. Not everyone agreed with the mockery, even if they stayed silent. When Luke returned to his cabin that evening, the laughter of the men echoed in his ears. He leaned against the post outside his home, watching the sun dip below the hills. A small voice inside asked if it was worth it, facing such ridicule for a simple act. But another voice, stronger, reminded him of Nahale's words. "Kindness is rare. When I see it, I remember it." He knew deep down that the laughter of shallow men could not outweigh the gratitude in her eyes. The very next morning, Nahale came again. This time she seemed different. She did not carry her bundle of sticks, nor did she lean on a walking stick. She stood tall, her posture straight, her eyes sharp and clear. Luke was surprised to see her at his gate once more. He stepped outside, brushing the dust from his shirt. "Good morning, ma'am," he greeted warmly. "What brings you here?" Nahela studied him for a long moment before speaking. "I wished to see if your kindness was true, or if it was a single moment." Luke frowned slightly. "I'm not sure I follow," she gave a faint smile. "Many men act kindly once when the world is watching, but true kindness shows itself again and again, even when no one expects it. I came today to test if your patience remains." Luke tilted his head, curious. "And how would you test it?" Nahel motioned for him to walk with her. "Come with me. I have something more to show you." Though puzzled, Luke agreed. He saddled his horse and walked beside her as she led him down a narrow trail. The desert stretched wide around them, the sun climbing higher with each step. They walked in silence for some time, Luke wondering what she was leading him toward. Finally, they reached a shaded grove near a small stream, where wildflowers bloomed against the rocks. Naheli sat on a stone and looked at him carefully. "You think you did something small in the town that day," she said. "But it was not small to me. You stood against the laughter of many, though you gained nothing in return. That shows a heart that cannot be bent easily." Luke shifted on his feet, uncomfortable under her steady gaze. "I only did what anyone should," he said again. She shook her head gently. "No, many should, but few will. That is why I wanted to see you again." Her expression softened then, her eyes warming. "I wish to introduce you to someone very dear to me. She is my daughter." Luke blinked, taken aback. "Your daughter?" Naheli nodded. "Yes, she is young, strong, and full of life. I have watched many men come forward with pride, with empty words, or with selfish hearts. None have shown the kindness you have. I believe she should meet a man who knows how to act with honor." Luke was stunned into silence. He had not expected this. He had thought Naheli wanted nothing more than to thank him or share her wisdom. But this he wasn't sure how to respond. His first thought was that he was not worthy of such a gesture. His second thought was that perhaps Naheli saw something in him he had never seen in himself. For a moment, Luke's mind drifted back to the town, to the jeers and laughter. Those men had mocked him for helping an old woman. They would mock him even more if they knew where this path was leading. Yet somehow their laughter seemed less important now. Nahal's words weighed heavier, as though they held the power to rewrite what others thought of him. Luke cleared his throat. "I don't know what to say." Nahali's smile widened slightly. "Say nothing for now. When you meet her, you will understand. But know this, my daughter does not need wealth or pride. She needs someone who will stand steady in the storm. Someone who shows his strength not by words, but by action. That is why I wish you to meet her." Luke nodded slowly, still dazed. He realized then that his life was taking a turn he had never imagined. He had thought himself a quiet cowboy who would live out his days in solitude, tending cattle and riding the wide plains. Yet here was an old woman telling him that his future might be tied to something greater than himself. As they rose and began to walk back, Luke felt a strange mix of nerves and anticipation. He did not know what awaited him, but he sensed that whatever came next would test him more than the laughter of the town ever had. When he reached his cabin once more, Nahele paused at the gate. She looked at him seriously. "Tomorrow," she said, "I will bring her to meet you." With that, she turned and walked away, her figure tall and strong against the setting sun. Luke watched her go, his heart beating faster than usual. He leaned against the fence, his mind full of questions. Who was her daughter? What would she be like? Why had Nahele chosen him of all men to meet her? The quiet evening stretched long as he tried to steady his thoughts. That night, as the stars appeared one by one in the dark sky, Luke sat by his small fire. The laughter of the townsfolk no longer filled his ears. Instead, he heard Nahele's words, soft, steady, powerful. And though he could not know it yet, the next day would change the path of his life in ways he never expected. The following morning came bright and clear. Luke rose earlier than usual, his mind restless from the promise Nahele had made the evening before. He could not help but wonder what kind of person her daughter might be. All through breakfast and while tending his horse, his thoughts circled the same questions. Would she be quiet like her mother, with eyes that seemed to see through people? Or would she be different, spirited and bold? He didn't know, but he felt a strange nervousness he wasn't used to. Luke was a cowboy who lived most of his life alone. He spoke to ranch hands when he needed to, dealt with townsfolk when business called for it, but rarely opened his heart to anyone. Yet today was different. Today he would meet someone important to Nahele. That fact alone carried weight. By mid-morning, Luke heard footsteps on the trail leading to his cabin. He stepped outside and saw Nahele walking toward him. Beside her was a young woman. She walked with grace, her step sure and light. The sun caught her dark hair, which was neatly braided and tied with a woven band of bright colors. Her eyes, deep and calm, searched the land ahead as though she belonged to it. Luke felt his breath catch for a moment. The young woman was beautiful in a natural way, not because of fancy clothes or painted looks, but because of her presence. She carried herself with quiet strength, and when she stood next to her mother, it was clear that dignity ran deep in their family. Nahele gestured toward her daughter. "Luke," she said, "this is Ayanna." The young woman met his eyes and offered a polite nod. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice calm but firm. Luke tipped his hat, suddenly aware of the dust on his boots and the roughness of his shirt. "Good morning," he replied, his voice steady though his heart felt strangely unsettled. Nahele smiled faintly, watching them both. "I will leave you two to speak," she said. With that, she stepped back, settling herself on the bench by the porch, allowing the younger ones space to talk. For a moment, silence hung between Luke and Ayanna. He wasn't sure what to say. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Would you like to sit?" he asked, gesturing toward a chair near the cabin. Ayanna nodded, and together they sat, facing the open fields that stretched beyond the fence. The wind carried the scent of sage, and the call of a hawk echoed overhead. Luke tried to think of words that wouldn't sound foolish. "Your mother speaks very highly of you," he said. Ayanna smiled slightly, her eyes lowering for a moment. "She speaks highly of you as well," she replied. "She told me how you helped her in town." Luke shifted in his seat. "It wasn't much," he said, repeating the words he had told Nahele before. "I only did what was right." Ayanna looked at him then, her gaze steady and thoughtful. "Many people say such things," she answered, "but few truly mean them. My mother does not trust easily. If she believes in your heart, then so do I." Her words struck Luke deeply. He realized she carried the same honesty her mother had. Direct, clear, without pretense. For the first time in a long while, he felt himself wanting to share more than he usually did. They began to talk, slowly at first, with simple questions about his ranch and her daily life. But soon the words flowed more easily. Luke told her about the wide plains, the cattle he raised, the quiet nights by the fire. Ayanna spoke of her weaving, of gathering herbs with her mother, and of the traditions she carried forward. As they spoke, Luke noticed how her eyes lit up when she described the meaning of the patterns in her weaving. "This," she said, pointing to the woven band in her hair, "tells of the river and the stars. It reminds me that life flows onward, even when the night feels endless." Luke listened with quiet admiration. He had always valued the land and its beauty, but he had never thought of it as something that told stories through symbols and colors. Hearing Ayanna's words opened a new way of seeing the world. Nahele watched from the bench, her face calm but pleased. She said little, allowing the two to grow comfortable with each other. When the sun reached its peak, she rose and joined them. "It is time we return home," she said to her daughter. She turned to Luke. "Thank you for giving her your time." Luke stood, tipping his hat again. "It was my honor," he said simply. Ayanna gave him one last glance before walking away with her mother. That glance stayed with Luke long after they disappeared down the trail. That evening, Luke found himself restless again. He sat by his fire, staring into the flames, replaying the conversation in his mind. The townsfolk had laughed at him for helping Nahele, but if not for that moment, he would never have met Ayanna. What others saw as weakness had led him to something unexpected, something that felt like the beginning of a new chapter in his life. Over the days that followed, Ayanna and Nahele visited more often. Sometimes Luke went to their hut, where Ayanna showed him how to grind herbs or weave simple patterns. Other times they came to his cabin, where he taught Ayanna how to guide a horse gently, or how to listen for changes in the wind that signaled a storm. Their worlds were different, yet slowly they began to share pieces of each other's lives. Luke found himself laughing more than he had in years, and Ayanna seemed to enjoy the quiet strength he carried. Nahele observed with satisfaction, speaking only when needed, guiding gently but never forcing. Meanwhile, the town continued to whisper. Some mocked more loudly, others began to watch with curiosity, A few even admitted quietly that perhaps Luke had seen something they had overlooked. What once seemed like humiliation was slowly turning into quiet respect. One evening, as the three of them sat together by Luke's porch, the sky painted with shades of orange and pink, Nahaley spoke. "You see now," she said, her eyes moving between Luke and Ayanna, "why I said kindness is never wasted. It leads us to places we cannot imagine." Luke nodded, his heart full but his words few. Ayanna smiled gently, and in that moment he realized that the laughter of the town had lost its power. What mattered now was the bond quietly growing before his eyes. The meeting that began with surprise had turned into something deeper. Luke knew that his life, once quiet and solitary, was no longer the same. And as he looked at Ayanna under the fading sky, he felt certain that this was only the beginning. The days that followed were unlike any Luke had known before. His life, once shaped by quiet routine, now carried a rhythm that felt fuller. Each morning he still rose early, tended to his cattle, and rode the land, but his thoughts often drifted toward Ayanna. He would catch himself smiling at the memory of her voice or the way her eyes lit when she explained something. Evenings no longer felt empty. They felt like steps toward something greater. The town still whispered. Some men continued to mock, though their laughter grew weaker when they saw Luke walking with Ayanna, or when they noticed the old woman Nahaley greeting him warmly in the marketplace. A few townsfolk began to look at him differently, no longer only as the quiet cowboy but as a man who carried respect beyond the fences of his ranch. The same act that once brought him humiliation was slowly turning into a story others repeated, with curiosity rather than cruelty. One afternoon, Luke was mending a section of fence when he heard the sound of footsteps. Looking up, he saw Ayanna approaching with a basket in her hands. She wore a simple woven shawl, and her long braid swung lightly with her steps. "Mother sent me with food," she said with a gentle smile. She set the basket down, revealing bread, herbs, and roasted corn wrapped in cloth. Luke wiped the sweat from his brow and grinned. "That's mighty kind of her, and you," he said. Instead of leaving quickly, Ayanna stayed. She asked about his work, and he explained how the cattle needed steady fences and how the land sometimes fought against the rancher's efforts. She listened carefully, then told him how her people believed land was not owned but cared for, like a living friend. Her words made Luke pause. He had never thought of it that way. But as he looked across the wide plains, he realized her perspective carried truth. Over the weeks, their conversations deepened. They spoke of simple things, seasons, animals, the ways of the land, but also of hopes and fears. Luke told her of the loneliness he often felt before, and Ayanna admitted she sometimes worried about being judged unfairly by the town. They understood each other in ways that did not need many words. Nahaley watched quietly as this bond grew. She never forced it, never pushed. But when she saw the way Luke and Ayanna looked at each other, she smiled with quiet satisfaction. "The world will always have those who laugh," she told Luke one evening when they sat together outside her hut. "But laughter fades. Respect once earned remains. What you did that day in town was not only for me, it was for yourself too, though you did not know it." Luke thought about her words long into the night. It was true. His life had changed because of that single act. Not because he had expected anything, but because he had chosen to do what was right even when others scorned him. That choice had led him here, sitting outside a warm home, speaking with people who had become important to him. One morning, Luke invited Ayanna and Nahaley to his ranch. He wanted to share more of his world with them. He saddled an extra horse and showed Ayanna how to ride across the open fields. She was cautious at first, gripping the reins tightly, but soon her laughter filled the air as the horse carried her forward with ease. Luke rode beside her, guiding her gently, proud to see her confidence grow. They stopped by a stream, letting the horses drink. Ayanna leaned down, touching the water, and smiled. "It feels alive," she said. Luke nodded. "It is. This land has a way of breathing with you if you listen." In that moment, Luke realized how much he had begun to see the land differently through her eyes. She taught him that life was more than work and survival. It was about connection, meaning, and the threads that tied people to the world around them. As the weeks turned into months, Luke and Ayanna grew inseparable. They walked the trails together, shared meals, and spent quiet evenings watching the stars. The townsfolk, once mocking, now watched with curiosity. Some admitted quietly that perhaps they had misjudged Luke. Others still held their prejudice. but their voices grew weaker with each passing day. Then came a day when the same group of men who had mocked Luke in the saloon tried again. They saw him walking with Ayanna in town and sneered loudly. "There goes the cowboy and his Apache bride-to-be," one said, drawing laughter from his companions. Luke stopped, turned slowly, and met their eyes. For a moment the town grew silent. Everyone waited to see how he would respond. But Luke did not raise his voice or his fists. He simply said, "You laughed when I helped an old woman. You laugh again now. But a man's worth isn't in your words. It's in his choices. And I don't regret mine." With that he turned and walked away with Ayanna at his side. The crowd stayed quiet. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed. The men who mocked him looked smaller than before, their laughter dying on their lips. From that day, the whispers in town changed. Luke was no longer spoken of as a fool. Instead, his name carried respect. The story of the cowboy who stood tall, even in humiliation, became one that mothers told their children as a lesson in honor. As time passed, Luke and Ayanna's bond deepened into love. They built a life together, one woven with respect, kindness, and understanding. Luke never forgot the way it all began, with an act that others mocked but that opened the door to a future brighter than he had ever imagined. Nahele, proud and content, reminded them often of the lesson. "Kindness," she said, "is a seed. Plant it, and though many will trample it, one day it grows into something stronger than laughter." Luke would smile at those words, knowing they were true. His life had proven it. In the end, what started as humiliation turned into honor. What began with laughter ended with love. And in the wide frontier, where dust and wind often erased footprints quickly, the story of Luke, Nahele, and Ayanna remained as a reminder that simple kindness could change everything.